Okay, so welcome to Module 11, where we're going to continue our discussion on organ systems that we find throughout the human body. And so today's module, we're going to focus on Chapter 10, which looks at the respiratory system. And so we're going to look at the system that is responsible for the exchange of gases within the body and within the bloodstream of the body. So with that, let's get started. So basically, the process of respiration takes place throughout the body, and we'll kind of talk about what that means here in a few seconds. But basically, with respiration, we have a couple of different levels we can examine the process of respiration at. And so respiration is basically, breathing or involves breathing, which is just the movement of air in and out of the lungs. And we'll talk specifically how that happens in one of the later videos in this module. And so breathing, when we say breathing or ventilation, we're just talking about air going in and out of the lungs. Now, in terms of respiration, there are kind of two levels of respiration that happen in the body. You have external respiration, and you have internal respiration, and then there's also cellular respiration. So I guess you could say three levels. Cellular respiration is not really a gas exchange process, but it's using a gas, right? So remember, cellular respiration is using oxygen to produce ATP, and then it produces the gas carbon dioxide as waste. So that is part of the respiration system, because that carbon dioxide is then later expelled, and respiration is required to bring that oxygen into the body. And so the two kind of big parts of the respiration process is external respiration, where you're exchanging gas between the body and the external environment. So the air is being exchanged within the blood of the lungs and the external air. So basically you breathe in air, the oxygen will go into the blood, the carbon dioxide will come out of the blood, and then you will exhale that carbon dioxide. So that's external respiration. Internal respiration is where gas exchange happens between the blood and the tissue. So this is at the kind of tissue level, where the capillaries are moving around those cells. And remember, we were talking about the capillary beds. And the oxygen is being dropped off from the capillaries to the tissues, to the cells, and then the carbon dioxide is being picked up from the tissues into the blood. Right, so that's the internal respiration. So external is the exchange of air with the blood in the lungs and the external environment. Internal respiration is the exchange of gases from the blood to the cellular tissue, so at that cellular level. Respiration, or the respiratory system, is also important because it functions with the production of sound. And so it's very important for communication to happen. You want to make sure you can identify or you can define these different levels of respiration, especially internal and external. All right, so now that we've kind of looked at where respiration takes place, let's look at the actual structures in the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is made up of an upper and lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract consists of the structures of the nose, the nasal passages, the sinus cavities, and the pharynx. The lower respiratory tract is made up of the larynx and the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, the lungs, and the alveoli. Okay, we have a figure here that's kind of showing all of those structures. So we've got our upper respiratory tract, okay, which is mouth, nose, nasal cavities, your tongue, your pharynx, and then what's not shown in this image are the different sinus cavities. Okay? And so you'll want to be familiar with the locations of these because you'll see them again on your test and then also your lab exams. The lower respiratory tract is basically from the epiglottis down. So the epiglottis is a little flap, cartilaginous flap that covers the trachea whenever you swallow food or drink, and it prevents those substances from going into the respiratory system. So it prevents aspiration. You have your larynx located in the trachea, which is part of the voice box, right, which is where sound production happens. And below that, you have so your trachea, which is the tube here. And in that trachea, that main airway divides into two main bronchi. And so these are your branching airways into each lung, so the left and the right lung. Okay. Now, those bronchi will then divide into even smaller branchways called bronchioles. Okay. And so we mentioned those bronchioles here, but they're not shown in this figure. But those bronchioles would be the smaller passageways that are branching off of that main bronchi, okay? Or that main bronchus. So bronchi is plural, and then you can say bronchus for a single branch. And then at the tip of the bronchioles, you have little clusters of single-celled tissue layers, and they're in the form of these grape-like clusters, these sacs, and that's the alveoli. And we'll look at a figure kind of zoomed into those here in a few minutes. But what's also part of the lower respiratory system, the diaphragm, which moves, contracts, and relaxes to help change the pressure in the thoracic cavity and in the lungs, which causes the movement of air in and out of the lungs. And we'll talk about how that happens in a little bit as well. And then you have your ribs protecting the lungs, and then the intercostal muscles, which helps the ribs move as those intercostal muscles contract and relax. And that causes the thoracic cavity to get larger and smaller, which again changes the pressure in the lungs. And in that pressure gradient, as we'll learn, is what allows the air or causes the air to either move into the lungs or to move out of the lungs. Okay. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about each of these two different tracts, the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract, individually, and talk about each of those parts that make up each tract. So the upper respiratory tract is responsible for filtering the air as it enters the body. So our noses we have hairs in our nose, which grabs stuff and traps particulate matter. And then we have mucus in our nasal cavities and also in our respiratory tract itself that helps to trap those particulate matter and bring it back up so we can expel it out of our body. Another important function for the upper respiratory tract is to warm the air so that it's not cold as it enters our body, and humidifies it so it's not dry, right? So it helps to keep it moist so it's not drying out the respiratory system. And the nose and the pharynx play a big part in performing those three activities, right? So the nose and the pharynx is that initial passageway for respiration. Our mouths are also important for bringing in that air. They both have receptors for smell, and then they filter those large foreign materials that are coming in. Right? So they moisten and warm that air. And then the upper respiratory tract also has the larynx, which is where our vocal sounds are made for communication. So if we zoom into just the upper respiratory tract, you can see sinus cavities here, which weren't shown on that original image. Your nasal cavity, the external nose, the auditory tube, your nostril, your pharynx. All right, so there's your nostril. This area is the pharynx. You have your tongue. This is the epiglottis, that cartilaginous flap, and so it will fold down and fold over the trachea and prevent food and water or drink from entering the trachea. And then you have the glottis, which is this area here. And then you have your larynx, you have your trachea below that, and then this structure behind, which we'll learn about when we talk about the digestive system, is the esophagus. So that's where the food and the liquid travels into our digestive tract. Okay? So you want to know all these structures for the upper respiratory system. Now the lower respiratory system begins at the larynx and kind of moves down past the epiglottis and into the trachea. Okay? So again, that epiglottis is that flexible flap of cartilage that routes air and food into their appropriate tubes, basically. And so I said that these things were part of the upper respiratory tract when they're actually not. And then again, if we look here, right, it's really the epiglottis up, right? So just to kind of make this distinction, because I really wasn't thinking whenever I was going through this figure, I was just kind of labeling. But this is the upper respiratory, and this is part of the lower respiratory. Right? So I just want to make that distinction so you don't get confused, because I know I worded it as if all of those were part of the upper respiratory tract. So upper respiratory tract are these structures here, and then these structures begin the lower respiratory, except the esophagus. The esophagus is part of the digestive system. Okay. And so continuing with the discussion of the lower respiratory, so we have the larynx, we have the epiglottis. The vocal cords are inside the larynx, and it helps to maintain an open airway down into our lungs. And once the air passes these structures, it then enters the trachea, which transports the air to and from the lungs, and very commonly known as the windpipe. What's interesting with the trachea is that there are these C-shaped cartilaginous rings that surround the trachea, and they have some smooth muscle in between that C shape, right? So let's say you have this C shape here of cartilaginous ring, and then inside that, you have some smooth muscle that connects one side of the C to the other, right? So that smooth muscle would connect it. This smooth muscle can contract to close the C, or it can relax to open the C. And so this is what kind of generates that cough reflex. And so if you cough, your C-shaped cartilaginous rings will actually get smaller. They will contract so that it will force the air up and out of the lungs and get rid of those foreign particles that may be trapped in the mucosis that's within the trachea. And so here's an image of the full kind of lower respiratory tract. So the major structures that are outside of the lungs. Well, there's the alveoli shown here too. So inside of the lungs as well. You have your larynx, you have the trachea, which goes down to here, and then it separates into the bronchi. All right, so here's your right bronchus, here's your left bronchus, and then pleural are bronchi. And then those will divide into these tinier bronchioles, and you can see these grape-like clusters at the end of the bronchioles. Those are known as the alveoli, and the alveoli are embedded in this capillary bed, and the exchange of gas from the lungs into the blood and from the blood into the lungs happens at the interface of the alveoli and the capillaries. And we have a zoomed in image showing what that actually looks like at the level of the alveoli and capillary interface. But before we get there, let's just kind of show what the larynx looks like and what the upper area of the trachea looks like. So this is an image of the larynx. You can see the vocal cords, right, which are here, which are also shown in this image. You have the epiglottis, which is that flap that would fold down over that opening. And then you have your upper trachea and the C-shaped cartilaginous structure. So you can see how they're C-shaped, and then this muscle here is that smooth muscle that will contract and relax to initiate that cough reflex. And we can actually zoom into these cartilaginous structures, and you can see that here. You can see that smooth muscle connected with cartilaginous tissue or connective tissue to the cartilaginous C-shaped ring. And whenever you have to cough, like I mentioned, that smooth muscle will contract, like on the right-hand side, cause those C-shaped rings to reduce the size, reduce their diameter, and that forces the air out, and it allows you to cough and expel any foreign particles that may be trapped inside the trachea or inside the lungs, and to get those irritants out. Now, looking at the kind of lower portion of the lower respiratory tract, we're going to now focus on the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli. Okay. So the bronchi are branches from the trachea that go to the left and the right lungs. And these structures contain ciliated epithelial cells, smooth muscles, and some cartilaginous structures. These cilia, the cilia that are in the epithelial cells, help to move foreign particles out of the respiratory tract. And we'll kind of show you what that cilia looks like. And then the bronchi will divide into smaller branches that don't have cartilage, and these are known as the bronchioles. Okay? And the function of the bronchi and the bronchioles is just to transport air, to clean it, to warm it, and to humidify it. And that cleaning happens with the cilia. Okay? And so that cilia will get rid of those foreign particles. And the whole purpose of the bronchi and the bronchioles, like we mentioned, is to transport air to and from the alveoli where the external respiration happens, so where the gas exchange happens with the blood. So here we have an image of a healthy airway. So this is healthy cilia. And then we have a smoker's airway, so somebody who has smoked for a prolonged period of time. And you can see there's no cilia. All the cilia are damaged or destroyed. And so this is why you can have like a terrible smoker's cough, because you're constantly coughing, trying to expel the foreign particles out of your body. But it's much, much harder because you don't have the cilia helping to move those foreign particles out of the bronchi and the trachea. Okay. And so next, moving on to the lungs. So the lungs are tissue that encloses the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, and the blood vessels that move into the lungs and interact with the alveoli. And so, like I mentioned, the alveoli are air pockets where that gas exchange happens. The lungs are located in the upper body cavity, so the upper anterior body cavity, the thoracic cavity. And each lung is surrounded by what's known as a pleural membrane. And if you remember, the thoracic cavity can be separated into the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. The lungs are found in the pleural cavity, and it actually contains fluid that is in those cavities, and that fluid reduces friction as the lungs move inside of that cavity. So as we exhale and inhale, our lungs are expanding and contracting in size. And so that is causing the lungs to move, and you don't want friction to happen on those important tissues and cause damage to those tissues. A little interesting fact about the lungs is that the lung that's in the right cavity, your right lung, actually has 3 lobes, while the left lung only has 2. And this is actually because the heart is, it kind of protrudes into the left space of the lung. And so the lung can't be large enough to have that third lobe. And so it's actually only 2 lobes in the left lung. And the lungs function independently of one another, so relatively independently of one another. And you actually can have a portion of your lungs removed, say in one lung, and still be okay, right? You'll still be able to function fairly normally. Now, your oxygen capacity will go down because you've lost lung space and surface area space, but you still can survive if you've had a portion of one of your lungs removed. Now, this shows the right lung here, the left lung. It shows the lobe, so lobe 1, 2, 3 in the right, lobe 1 and 2 in the left, and it shows the heart here, and it shows how it kind of protrudes into the space of that left lung, whereas the right lung kind of doesn't have anything to compete with for space. And so that's one of the reasons why the left lung only has 2 lobes. Okay. And so that's it for the first video in this module, where we just really become familiar with the structures of the upper and lower respiratory systems. Now, in the second video, we're going to kind of dive into how gas exchange happens, and we'll actually look at the alveoli and the capillary interface in much more detail, and talk about kind of what goes on in external respiration and internal respiration in the next video. Okay? And so with that, we'll see you in the second video.